Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast, off-season edition. Jack Stern, Spencer Michaelis with you tonight. Got a couple of moves to talk about this week. The Major League Baseball offseason officially underway as of Thursday. The Los Angeles Dodgers winning the World Series on Wednesday night, defeating the New York Yankees in 5 games. So that means that we already have a little bit of action right now. The floodgates haven't necessarily opened, but players are now able to elect free agency. As of this recording, we're in the middle of a kind of an exclusive window where teams can negotiate with their free agents before they officially are available for all of the open market. That's, I believe it's like 5 days after the conclusion of the World Series that opens for everybody. But players like Willy Adames, we'll get to Wade Miley in a few minutes as well, guys who are now on the open market, or I should say not rostered by the Brewers anymore at this point. Coaches becoming free agents as well. That's a big part of what we'll talk about this week. So some good offseason stuff to dive into here right off the bat. This ended up being really good timing for recording our next episode. As a reminder, for the offseason, unless there's some sort of crazy breaking news, we're switching to a every other week schedule for releasing podcasts as opposed to every week like we did in season, because there's generally not as much to go over every week. But we've got a little bit to go through for you this week. First of all, though, Spencer, how have you been since the last time we did this? It's been a few days.
I've been doing well, Jack. It's been a few episodes since you asked me that, and I wasn't hurt by that at all, but I did notice. So just saying. But
well,
I've been good.
I have seen you outside of the recording of this show, so I felt like, it didn't necessarily need to be spelled out on camera, but I'm sorry that I hurt your feelings.
We always know how each other are doing. It's just, being kind and a nice person, but it's fine. I'm not upset about it at all. I'm moving on now, but I have been good. I did watch the World Series. Wasn't sure how much playoff baseball I'd be able to watch. Eventually I got to it and ended up watching quite a bit of it, but watched most of the World Series. Even though it was 5-1, it was actually pretty exciting, which was nice to see. Most of the games were pretty competitive, and obviously some walk-offs, and Freddie Freeman is a monster that just has never gotten the respect he deserves. So it was cool to see him win that World Series MVP, and it was cool to see like his story come out. I thought during the whole World Series, with everything that he went through as a kid and now what he's going through now, and he also was dealing with a bunch of injuries. So Freddie Freeman's always been one of my kind of favorite non-Brewers, so it was cool to see him have all that success. But yeah, that's pretty much what I've been up to, is still just a lot of baseball, just a lot less Brewers baseball. But how you been, Jack?
Been fantastic. I was actually going to bring up that story you just mentioned. I was going to ask if you saw that he was playing through broken rib cartilage as well, Freeman, that is, which
yeah.
The Passan kind of talked about it in the story, but the ankle injury was kind of convenient cover for that, because every time you'd see him wince after a swing, it was easy to just say, must be the ankle that's flared up. But it turns out a lot of that was actually because he's dealing with pain in his chest. So not something that's easy to play through. But I'll also say, you said 5 games to 1 series. That's pretty impressive that the Dodgers not only won the series, but won 5 games in that series. So I guess
no, I said it was 5 games. Only one wasn't competitive, was what I was saying.
Oh,
I didn't say
okay.
5-1.
All right. I guess I got to put my listening ears on a little bit more closely. But with that, I guess we can finally dive into a little bit of what's going on the Brewers front. Big story that we have from the last couple of weeks now here is some coaching changes. As we mentioned, most of the contracts for the Brewers coaches expiring after this season. And now that we're past the conclusion of the World Series, anyone who has not been signed to a new deal on that staff has had their contract expire, or most of them, that is. We'll talk about a couple of guys who are at least going to stick around. But the main shakeup that actually broke earlier on Thursday is Quintin Berry, the Brewers' former first base coach now. After 4 years in Milwaukee, he is heading down I-94 to join Craig Counsell on his staff as the third base coach. But other than that, he's going to have kind of a similar role where he works a lot with base running. He'll just be in that third base coach's box instead of at first base. So I'll admit it, it's kind of funny to go through and look at the reactions right now, because you're kind of seeing an admittedly much smaller version of some of the backlash that Craig Counsell got when he left. I'm sifting through my replies, and I'm seeing people talking about Quintin Berry being a traitor because now he's going to Chicago. But look, here's the deal with this. A point that I think is worth making now, because you have Q Berry going to Chicago. He may not be the last Brewers coach that goes to rejoin Craig Counsell in Chicago. We don't know. He most certainly won't be the final Brewers personnel in franchise history to eventually join the Chicago Cubs. So I think this does need to be spelled out, because I'm not sure people always realize it. From everything that I've gathered, just being around baseball people, the rivalries that you see between a lot of teams, particularly like the Brewers and the Cubs, a lot of that is more so tied to the fan bases than I think it is a lot of the guys who are actually on the field. So I think you can still talk about the Craig Counsell thing being a little shocking, because he was the manager here for a long time, but also kind of played up the whole "I'm from here, I'm one of you" type shtick. And I think that's why it really left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, and probably will for the rest of his career, if not longer. Quintin Berry never played that same game, though, talking about how he was from here. Like, he's not the hometown kid. He's been around before. He was a little bit of a journeyman when he was a base running savant as a player back in his playing days. And now he's going to a different team where he gets a promotion, gets to work under a guy that he's worked under in 3 of his 4 years as a big league coach. And I think that these are all factors that, like it or not, these are just farther up on the priority list than, oh, there's a rivalry between these two fan bases. I think that a lot of the guys who are on the field for these kinds of matchups, especially like Brewers and Cubs, I think most of these players, coaches, whatever, I think they just see it as, this is another team of fellow baseball guys. And I know that might kind of clash a little bit with the way that some fans perceive there to be a huge rivalry here. But I think that really the only difference is, that these guys are in direct competition with you for the division. I'm sure that adds a little bit of extra fuel. But in terms of like animosity or betraying the team because you went to a division rival, like, I don't really think that that's how a lot of these moves actually work. So I don't have anything against Q Berry for deciding to rejoin Craig Counsell. Again, he's getting a new opportunity down there. He's getting a little bit of a promotion, gets to work under a guy that he's worked under for most of his career as a coach. So good for him. And I guess before we kind of move on to the next point with Q Berry's departure, Spencer, do you have any initial thoughts or initial reactions when you saw this news? I know it was also reported a couple days prior that the Brewers are not expected to be able to retain Quintin Berry as their first base coach.
Yep. Yeah. Once I saw that news, to be honest with you, my first thought was Chicago. That's honestly going to be my first thought anytime I hear anybody who was previously on Counsell's staff who hung around is leaving. I mean, that's seems like the safest, not assumption, but the safest guess as to where they're going to go next. And like you said, it's a promotion. It's from first base to third base coach is seen as a promotion. I'm sure there's money involved in everything else, but like you said, I think when you look at a rivalry in any sport, that's usually coming more from the fan base than anyone else. Now, I think within a season, there could be things that pop up, like, for example, opening week with the Mets. I'm guessing the Brewers and Mets weren't super friendly as the season continued, and obviously into the wild card, they weren't, because of something that had happened in that season. I would imagine by next year, there's going to be very few hard feelings from either team on what happened this year. Like, it doesn't carry over like that. There's not pure hatred for most of these guys. In fact, a lot of them have probably kind of crossed paths throughout their career, and a lot of them probably know each other somewhat personally. So yes, there are, Yankees, Red Sox is probably still considered a rivalry even for players, but in that regard, it's mostly because the fans get so amped up for it that the games have more of a high stakes feel to them when there's fans going crazy. So I'm sure for Brewers Cubs, players kind of feel that too. Like, yeah, they're competing for the division, but there's also pretty much always going to be a sellout for those games. And there's going to be the fans are going to be super into it. So from that perspective, yes, they know it's a rivalry. They feel the rivalry, but do they hate everybody on the other team? No. And it's the same for the coaching staff. It's just, it isn't how it works. And yeah, kind of from a fan's perspective, sucks to hear that, but it is what it is. And like Jack said, this is, for him, it's an opportunity to work with somebody that he spent a bunch of time with already. He's clearly very comfortable with him. And it's a promotion. I don't think the Cub, if Counsell went to Houston, he probably is with Houston right now. Like, that's just kind of how it works in this regard. It's not a matter of he's leaving the Brewers for the Cubs because of anything that he's trying to shove it in the Brewers fans' face that he's going to Chicago. It's a personal move for him to further his career, and it's for a guy that he knows well. So I think Jack pretty much nailed it, and I think there's no reason to have any animosity towards Quintin Berry for making this move. And it is different with Counsell because of the hometown connection and the fact that he did always play up that hometown connection as much as he did. Every other person, it's a totally different set of circumstances. Counsell's kind of the outlier in this equation. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about how a lot of these guys across teams, across organizations, they cross paths with each other, and a lot of them probably know each other pretty personally. And I think that really hits at it. It's not so much, I don't think, rivalry, like boundary by organization in that sense. I think it's for all these guys, it's more so about like the personnel, like who are on which teams in a given year. Like, yeah, if you have problems with certain players who are on a team a certain year, there might be some fiery tempers there, but a lot of that gets reset year to year because
Yeah.
no team is going to look exactly the same from one year to the next. At the end of the day, I think it's a lot more about the relationships that all of those moving parts, all of those players, all those coaches, those relationships that they have with each other, they're going to cross paths. They're going to have some kind of relationship with each other more often than not. I don't think they really care about the organizational lines determining what those relationships look like, what those interpersonal
Yep.
relationships look like. Like, you even saw it when Craig Counsell came back this year, or when he came back when he played the Brewers in spring training, or when he came back to Milwaukee. Like, I never at any point picked up on really any feelings of animosity. Like, you had Willie Adames going out there and giving him a hug. Like, I don't think guys really took it as personally as the fans did. I think it was still a little bit of a shock to see him go there, but I think guys got over it pretty quickly. I think guys kind of recognize that the professional relationship is going to be a little different now. The interpersonal relationship, probably not as much. And I think that's just a big part of it to keep in mind. And the way that I kind of squared is divisional rivals and teams that are in direct competition for each other like that. I think those games take on an added intensity, but I don't think that means that that makes you mortal enemies with the actual
Right.
people that you're competing against in those games. I think there's a distinction to be made there. So whenever you see a move like this, especially for like someone like Q Barry, who is probably going to end up working for quite a few big league organizations in all kinds of different capacities, because he's proven that
Mhm.
he's a smart guy, especially on the base running side, because that was basically what he did for a job as a player. They're just, I don't think there's really anything personal about making that kind of move. If there's anything personal about it, it's that he has the good relationship with Craig Counsell. So now he's rejoining him down there. But I understand when people just kind of look at this on the surface level and don't really think about this stuff and they're frustrated. But I think people just would be better off. It'd be better for their mental health, better for their perception of the game if they just got over stuff like this, because it's not going to be the last time it happens. And again, like, it's a fluid baseball ecosystem where all of these guys cross paths with each other. They're going to develop relationships with each other, and there are going to be aspects of that relationship that probably are not going to be influenced by which team you happen to be with that given year. So good for Q Barry. He's getting a new opportunity. And before we pivot, we should probably talk about what does this mean for the Brewers now on the field. And I think there's kind of a mixed reaction right now. I think there's some people who are like, well, at least the Brewers kept some other important coaches who we'll talk about in a minute, or this is a big loss for the Brewers. And the way that I kind of see it is this: Quintin Berry is very good at what he does. Being in the clubhouse this year, you would hear guys rave all the time about the influence that he had on their base running ability. Because to be a good base runner, you don't just need to be fast. You need to be a smart base runner. You need to also be a perceptive base runner. You need to be good at reading cues from the pitcher. You need to be good at timing out the pitcher. You got to get on base and you got to kind of wait it out. Like watch him throw a pitch or two. You got to see if you can get some timing down. But when you go to first base and Q Berry's there and he's already got all these notes on the guy, they do meetings they would do meetings all the time with Q Berry before series and before games, looking over notes on pitchers, looking over cues on pitchers. Bryce Terang especially talked about all of this stuff for a story I did on his base running during the middle of the year. They'd have meetings about all this stuff. So they'd have all this stuff going in. As soon as he gets to first base, Q's got some notes for him again that he's kind of reminding him of, or some cues that maybe he's noticed from this pitcher so far in the game. And then he's also got the ability to help him adapt too, if there are different things like that. So I do think that this is a loss for the Brewers. This is a guy who's been very, very instrumental in getting them to where they're at. And I think he has been a difference maker in that, you can have all these fast guys like Bryce Terang, Sal Frelick, Garrett Mitchell, pretty much all of the outfielders and Bryce Terang. Those are basically the Brewers' most valuable base runners this year. He had a very big role in making those guys not just really speedy athletic players, but applying that speed and athleticism and maximizing it on the bases by really coaching them on how to run the bases, how to pick your moments, how to make smart base running plays, how to be aware of the situation, what to look for, and how to time things up when you're trying to steal second or third base. Those are very important things. And I think he really helped those guys build up those strengths. So in that sense, it is going to be different when these guys get to first base and Q Berry's not there anymore to maybe give them, a little bit of instruction right away, or to oversee these meetings before the game. But at the same time, just because Q Berry's gone now, that doesn't mean that they're going to magically forget everything that he told them. I'd be willing to bet that a lot of the systems that he put in place for educating guys on base running, a lot of the just general principles of base running that he taught these guys, those systems are still going to be intact. Most of these guys, if not all of them, are still going to remember most, if not all, of what he taught them, because he got the chance to work with a lot of them for a couple of years. Like, the Brewers are still going to be a very good base running team. They've already built this up thanks in large part to Q Berry. Now the focus is more so on, can we maintain these strengths? Can we maintain the smart and educated base running that made us so successful on the bases in 2024? And I think that gets a little trickier to do without Q Berry. Ideally, he would have stuck around and he could continue to help you just maintain the level that you got to thanks to him. But you don't necessarily need Quintin Berry to keep guys at the level they've reached with this base running. That's kind of the way that I look at it. I think the Brewers are going to be fine without him. I also think that just generally guys in his position, I don't think, no matter how good you are at it, I'm not sure it's a position where you always need to be like, we need to keep this guy at all costs.
Yeah.
And, I don't know what the discussions are like behind the scenes, but I would be willing to bet that's kind of how the Brewers see it as well. Like, this is not a position where we need to go all out to keep our first base / base running / outfield defense coach. Like, he did a very good job at that. I would be willing to guess he's probably one of the better guys in the business at doing that job, but he's already laid the groundwork for everything the Brewers do on those sides of the ball. And I think you can get by with having a different guy now, or a different group of guys helping to maintain what he built. So again, in an ideal world, you would keep Q Berry around and he would stay. But I think the Brewers are largely going to be fine. I don't think there's going to be a massive difference in what the base running looks like moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like, we don't want to undersell what he did, because it was important and he was part of building this kind of baseline of how they do things. And clearly it worked really well. And obviously part of the stolen base renaissance is due to the new rules and everything else too. So that's part of the equation here. But everything Berry did helped the Brewers, and especially a lot of the younger guys who are going to be the ones running, learn how to steal bases at a really good level. Like Jack said, though, that knowledge doesn't just go with Quintin Berry to Chicago. It's still with all the players who are here. And I would imagine Quintin Berry was not the only coach who was involved in a lot of these meetings and a lot of these things that happen. So other coaches are also kind of aware of it and are able to kind of keep, like Jack said, the system in place as things move forward. So it's not nothing that he left, but it's a minimal loss in the long run, most likely. And it's something that's replaceable. It's somebody that you can bring in and get somebody to do a similar job, and be thankful that Barry did lay really good groundwork for them to work off of. And that's really the only way I think we need to look at it. I would not expect this to impact the Brewers in terms of being an aggressive base stealing team or an aggressive base running team or anything like that. Like that's, I don't think anything really changes other than maybe as a like prolific base stealer like he was, he may have had, certain things in game that he was really good at picking up on. That would be my one guess as to the only thing that might change with somebody new that might just not be as good at that because it was something he did as a player too. But that's really all I can think of.
Right. And that's kind of what our first question that we're going to take for this week was about. Cheesehead Kami asked us, how impactful is losing Barry going to be? Specifically, how does that relate to stolen bases? Do you expect stolen bases to be less relevant under a new coach? Just things of that nature. And I think that, like we've said, it's still going to be largely the same. Maybe they steal a few less bases or a little bit fewer bases in 2025. I think the real impact, which is actually probably not going to be something that guys or viewers, external viewers, fans pick up on as much, is kind of what you talked about, like these little moments where, oh, that was a smart base running play like there. And maybe that was the result of Quintin Berry kind of tapping a guy on the shoulder and being like, hey, I see this. Or, hey,
Mm-hmm.
reminder, this is the situation. Like, look to take this extra base here. Or here's this cue from this pitcher. We can take an extra base here. Just little things like that. I think it adds up a little bit over the course of the season. And if you're trying to quantify it, like probably the best way would be like if you look at like the StatCast or the Fangraphs base running metrics, if you look at like year by year, maybe the Brewers go from, so this year I believe they were first in baseball and Fangraphs base running runs above average. Maybe they go from first to third or fourth. Like I think they're still going to be up there, but maybe you see a marginal difference in those that you could maybe attribute to a few plays where you didn't have someone who is like quite as like such a trained, like not even trained eye, just naturally instinctual eye like Q Berry, because he's very good at picking that up. That's not easy to do. Like there are just guys who kind of stand out from others because of their ability to do that. So maybe if there's a few plays here and there where, new first base coach or base running coach doesn't get that cue or doesn't pick up on this thing that maybe Barry would have picked up on. But I think in the long run, over a large sample, I don't think that's going to have a massive impact really on the outcome of the Brewers season. So I think that's the best way to look at it. Maybe a few fewer stolen bases, maybe a little bit fewer of those sneaky, smart base running plays that you kind of have to watch the game really closely to be like, oh, that was really heads up. But all in all, you're not going to see any changes to their identity on the bases. Like that stuff as well is always going to be player driven.
Yep.
And the Brewers were just in a really good spot where they had a guy in Quintin Berry who, as a lot of these younger, speedier guys were coming up through the system and starting to surface in the big leagues, then Quintin Berry really got to break them in. Like I haven't looked at the base running metrics from year to year, but the Brewers stole more bases this year than they did last year.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's not necessarily Quintin Berry. That's now Quintin Berry has all the guys who profile as guys who can be very good base stealers because they're fast. So then Quintin Berry kind of coaches them up to push them to that next level. And that's how you get as many steals as you got this year. Like that's always going to be player driven. So as long as the Brewers have the same core of young position players, which for the most part they should for the foreseeable future, like all of their best base stealers are probably still going to be around for a few years yet. So again, like that's their approach is not going to change because they're going to have those same players with those same strengths. Maybe the application isn't always quite as fantastic as it was under Quintin Berry, but I'd be willing to bet it's going to be pretty darn close. And who knows,
Yeah.
maybe we won't even, with the metrics that we have, be able to tell a difference.
Yeah, agreed.
We can move on then to some more positive news. So we talked about Quintin Berry leaving the organization, but the Brewers also making a couple other changes to their coaching staff while also retaining a very important part of their coaching staff. Milwaukee actually announced just a couple days before Berry reportedly departed for Chicago that they had re-signed Chris Hook to a multi-year contract to remain as the team's pitching coach. And they actually did that before contracts officially expired after the World Series. So basically re-upping with Hook before he even really got a chance to formally explore the open market. So new deal for Chris Hook. He's going to be around for a little while longer. We don't know how long it is. We just know it's multiple years. So the Brewers locking up that pitching coach role for the foreseeable future. And I know we had actually talked about, I think like in July or August, whenever it was, whichever episode, we got that question about what would the Brewers do without Chris Hook. And we both kind of agreed on the conclusion that Chris Hook is a very important part of the organization. They probably could survive without him in the long run because, again, kind of like what we talked about with Q Berry, like as soon as a guy leaves the organization, all of the knowledge that he brought to the organization doesn't just vanish into thin air. It's still going to be instilled in, the remaining personnel who spent a lot of time with him, talked to him. And for an organization like the Brewers that emphasizes continuity, that's a big part of what they do. They pass the messaging down, try to keep things consistent. I'm sure that the Brewers were already starting to at least prepare for scenarios down the line in which Chris Hook did not stick around. So they probably had, kind of the next guy, or probably do have the next guy in the system who could be the next Chris Hook. Remember, Chris Hook was promoted from within the organization. He rose up the minor league ranks and took over that head pitching coach job going into 2019. And I'm sure they were doing something similar already with some of their minor league coaches. And the downside that we had talked about was more so that the Brewers might be on rocky territory in the short term if Chris Hook left. And I think we actually kind of saw it a little bit in Chris Hook's first year, where it was a little bit of a rocky transition. And then all of a sudden, bam, things really took off after that because you were going from Derek Johnson to a new pitching coach in Chris Hook, who very smart guy in his own right, as we eventually found out. But, it's a new voice, new job for him, position he's never quite been in before. Like, there's a transition period with that. And I think that would have really been the biggest impact of losing Chris Hook, in that a lot of the stuff that he, number one, maybe helped put into place, or just his ability to communicate with guys. I think losing that for a year and having to transition to a new guy, it might have been some rocky territory. Then it probably would have settled down pretty quickly and they would have been fine long term because, again, a lot of the stuff that Chris Hook preaches is very well ingrained in this organization's pitching development culture. It's not all exclusive to Chris Hook, but by keeping him around, you've now ensured that you don't need to worry about that kind of transition for at least a few more years. And to me, that's really the benefit of this move. Chris Hook is a very smart guy. I get the chance to talk to him a lot now. I talked to him for several different pitching related stories that I did this year. And what you see about him is how good he is at picking up on stuff and how good he is at communicating that. He's got a very down to earth way of speaking. You have a conversation with him about pitching and, you can be talking about some pretty in-depth pitching stuff, but it almost sounds like water cooler talk because he makes it so concise, so simple. He doesn't try to sound smart. And I think that's something guys really resonate with. Those are things you need to be good at to be a really good coach at any level, in any area, in any sport, or just a good leader in any regard. And he's got that. He's got the relationship with guys. So just keeping him around now really ensures that the Brewers are still going to have the head messenger of what they're all about on the pitching side. And I think that's really the big thing here. A lot of the stuff that really helps guys figure things out and helps them click, a lot of those suggestions for adjustments do come from Chris Hook. Some of them don't. And when some of them don't, it's still Chris Hook who is responsible for handling the messaging and helping guys implement those changes. It's a group effort. And this is what he talked about right after they announced that new deal. He spoke to the media. He said, look, it's not always about me. It's about the systems that we have in place. And that's really the big thing. And they have a lot of guys who go into this process. They have guys in the front office who help identify, what it could take to bring out the best in a guy. And they might say to Chris Hook, like, hey, this is what we want him to work on. Or they might give a guy to Chris Hook and Chris Hook sees something right away and says, hey, here's what we should do with pitch selection, mechanics, whatever. But the bottom line is he's very good at instilling the messaging that these guys need to become the most deceptive versions of themselves. And it's just good to keep that guy around so that the messaging is going to stay consistent. Again, it's a situation where the Brewers could have survived long-term probably without Chris Hook, but there's absolutely no harm in continuing to have a guy who's one of the best in the business at his position and just having the ability to keep that messaging consistent. So that's what's going to be the case now that Chris Hook is sticking around.
Yeah, you touched on pretty much everything I wanted to say there. It's not, again, somebody who's completely irreplaceable. I don't think the Brewers have anybody on their staff who is. I don't think anybody in baseball has anybody on their staff who is. But the Brewers in particular have a really good set up in terms of a system for pretty much every position and everything. And it's actually something that probably should be acknowledged a bit more, is that they kind of view their minor league coaches like a prospect system of players. It's very similar how they do things. They don't hire many, like, yes, bench coaches or a first base coach or something that might come from outside the organization. But when they look at like their pitching and their hitting coaches, a lot of them do move through the system with the Brewers because they want to have a clear message that never really changes as these guys climb through the system and then get to the majors. You don't want to have the system set up in the minors and then bring in a hitting coach that has a completely different philosophy than what they've been learning the whole time. So like the Brewers would have survived, but like we said way back whenever we did that initial podcast about it, it would have taken time for them to get used to the new coach and the new coach to get used to the major league players. Like that's where I don't even want to say issue, but that's where there would have probably been like a bit of an off year or maybe two. Like that, we saw it in 2019, like Jack talked about it. It did take some time. I remember the fan reaction. People thought Derek Johnson left, and that first season without him did not go very well, and people were freaked out. And now I think people would have been freaked out if Chris Hook left only 4 years after that or 4 seasons after that. So like there would have been that year of time where it probably wouldn't have been great. And I think that was always the main concern. And if you don't have to have that, then don't have it and keep a guy who is very good at his job. Like I keep saying he'd be replaceable, but that doesn't mean the next guy would be as good as Chris Hook. Chris Hook's really good at his job, but it would be something where it's not going to kill you at any point if he did end up leaving, where you would be able to replace it serviceably and keep things moving in a productive way for the pitching staff. So, yeah.
And I think we should note, like, when we say nobody's irreplaceable or like you could get by without this guy, you could replace him. We're saying that in the sense of like, if this is the route that things unfortunately have to take, like you're going to be okay. I think in a perfect world, the Brewers would just love to keep everybody forever as long as it keeps working. But that's just not the way that this stuff works. So like when we talk about, they can get by without Q Berry. That doesn't mean we're saying Q Berry is not valuable or that, you can kind of just shrug your shoulders at Q Berry leaving. It's not ideal, but you can still make it through. Like if this is the way that things need to go, you can find a way to make it work. So in that sense, like you don't need to pour all of your chips into keeping Q Berry. It's the same thing with Chris Hook in a similar sense, but I would say I do think there's more value in keeping him around than there would have been in keeping Q Berry around because Berry with, base running and defense, like those are very big parts of what the Brewers do. But like take base running, for example. That's a component of scoring runs and of, making things happen offensively. Chris Hook is like right at the middle of the run prevention. Like he is right at the center of it. And, even if he's not always, like I said, if he's not always the guy who's coming up with, the strategy idea or the specific adjustment for this guy, he's the one who's informed about it. He's the one who's got to deliver a lot of the messaging about it. Like he is right in the middle of everything. And he's so good at just kind of orchestrating the whole thing. Like you need a ringleader when you have a system like he talked about. And the Brewers have kept their ringleader, and that's a big deal. And this is, in my mind as well, like just their ability on the pitching side, especially when you look at what they do on the pitching side. They're maximizing so many guys who a lot of people would say, well, they should not be getting these kinds of results that they're getting right now. I think on the base running side, you can at least see like, here's the explosive raw talent. And then here's Q Berry kind of polishing it up a little bit. On the pitching side, so often it's like Chris Hook being right at the middle of helping guys completely transform themselves. And I think that does make him more valuable than Q Berry. So, like, if you're trying to put together a tier list of who the Brewers really needed to keep, I'm not sure if I would put Chris Hook at number 1, but I think at the very least he's number 2. Yeah, Chris Hook was like at 1 or 2 in terms of if there were guys the Brewers really needed to focus on keeping, it's this guy. That doesn't mean you need to do every single thing in your power to keep him, but you try pretty damn hard to keep him, and it worked out for both sides. So Chris Hook is still going to be around, and that should be good news for everybody. Unless you have more thoughts on Chris Hook, we can kind of move on a little bit to something that he said in his Zoom call that he did after the news was announced. He kind of talked about potential roles for guys moving forward. The last that we had heard about guys like DL Hall and Aaron Ashby was Matt Arnold giving the kind of GM answer on, well, we could use them in any role. Pat Murphy had said he preferred to have Ashby in particular stretched out, but that wasn't really a statement on how they were going to use him. Chris Hook offering a little bit more detail, making it sound like he at least wants DL Hall and Aaron Ashby to both go into spring training next year as starting pitchers and to prepare for trying to earn a rotation spot in camp. So that brings us to a question from Mitchell, who asks about those comments. Who do you think has the higher chance of sticking in the rotation? He thinks it's DL Hall. And then he has a second question as well. If you think the rotation is full, would you rather have Hall start in AAA to grow as a starting pitcher or pitch out of the MLB pen? Spencer, I've done a lot of talking so far. Do you want to take this one first, especially since these guys were prospects not too long ago and you're the prospect guys? So
Sure. Nice. I like that. Good segue.
yeah, good segue.
No, I think it's Hall that's more likely to stick between the two of them. I agree with Mitchell on that. I will say if he doesn't make it, I do actually prefer he stay in AAA and try and be stretched out and remain a starter, mainly because I think the Brewers bullpen is going to be fine no matter what, but starting pitching depth is going to be something that they are probably trying to deal with throughout the season again, like they did this year. And you would be getting more value out of him if he's able to stay stretched and perform as a starting pitcher. So that's how I would kind of just broad strokes answer those questions. But I do think going into next year, for me, I just have a really hard time seeing Ashby able to have the command to go and pitch in extended outings. I like Ashby's stuff a ton. I've always liked Ashby's stuff a ton. I know, Jack, before we were doing this and back when he was more just coming up to the majors, like we put somewhat lofty expectations on him in terms of saying like we thought he could be one of the best lefty starters in baseball if he could kind of put it together the way he was capable of, like reaching his ceiling. He could be one of the best. And coming off the shoulder injury, that is part of it. I'm not sure he'll get stretched out safely and healthy in a healthy fashion because of the shoulder, but also I just don't see the command ever coming around. Even before the shoulder, it was a problem. I don't imagine it's going to be much better after the shoulder. So I just don't think he's going to make it. And that's why I give Hall the better chance. I don't even know if I super believe that DL Hall is going to be able to start moving forward. especially without improvement in the fastball that we've talked about a lot. But I think he's more likely between the two. And again, on the other question, I just think it would bring more value to the team next year and potentially in the future if they continue trying to stretch him out until they absolutely know that they can't. And then if it gets to that point, then yeah, put him in the pen where he'll probably be a pretty solid reliever, but it's still not as valuable as it would be if he can become a legitimate like mid rotation or even just a starter of any kind. There's more value there than what he's going to bring overall in the pen. So that's how I'm looking at it, I guess, for both of those guys. How about you, Jack?
Yeah, I would view it pretty similarly. I think that they should give DL Hall another run as a starter, and the main reason I want them to is because I think all three of his secondary pitches are good pitches.
Yes.
The slider, the curveball, and the changeup. I actually think he took some steps with all three of those pitches this year from what we saw. Like, they are good secondary pitches. He has a full arsenal. So I think that you really just need to try to make something out of that and see if you can turn that into a workable starter profile. I will say on him, I was very high on him coming into the 2024 season after the Brewers acquired him. And part of it was like, yes, he's got a full arsenal of secondaries that he's still trying to work on, but those always kind of flash some potential. And then you pair that with a fastball that got a 70 grade like earlier in that season.
Mm-hmm.
You're dealing with a pretty good profile. The problem now is, and I wrote about this last week, at this point in time, I don't believe DL Hall has a 70 grade fastball as a starting pitcher. DL Hall might have like a 30 grade fastball as a starting pitcher, a 40 grade fastball.
Yeah.
Like, it's not good. Like, and that's such a huge disconnect between his reputation when the Brewers acquired him and the reality. And I hope I'm proven wrong. Maybe he gets an offseason to, more fully recover from that ligament damage in his knee. And that helps him mechanically to get some more life back on that pitch. But the reality is, even when he came off the IL and the velocity went back up to where you would expect it to be as a starter, he was throwing like 96 to 98 out of the pen. As a starter, the thought was always he'd be more like, 94-ish. And that's where he was when he came off the IL. So you could tell that the knee was better. But the shape, so the vertical ride on that pitch, the induced vertical break, he only gained like an inch when he came back.
Yeah.
And it became pretty evident that that was not enough to really change a whole lot about how that pitch played. Guys didn't barrel it up nearly as much as they had before he went on the IL. In fact, I think the average exit velocity against it was actually pretty solid. After he came back, it was in like the mid 80s as opposed to being probably like over 90 before he went on the injured list. But the whiffs did not come back. His whiff rate went from 10% on the fastball, so 10% of swings on the fastball were swings and misses when he had the really bad fastball, when he was throwing like 90 to 92. When he came off the IL and was sitting 94 and touching as high as 96, his whiff rate only went up to 14%, which is still really bad for a fastball. The league average for a four-seamer was like 21%, I think it was in 2024. Like, that should be more of a swing and miss pitch, but it's not. And the reality is, all we've seen from him so far is that when he's been stretched out, that fastball does not miss bats.
Yeah.
And that's a problem because you're going from a guy who was supposed to be able to basically build around his fastball. His fastball was supposed to be like the slam dunk elite pitch. And then we got to see if the secondaries can take the jumps to make him a good starter. Now you're almost looking at the exact opposite, where it's okay, if he's going to start, it's going to be based on the secondaries. And he almost, instead of building around the fastball, needs to work around the fastball. Like, he needs to pitch in a way that instead of the fastball doing so much heavy lifting and being the anchor of his arsenal, it now needs to be something he needs to try to compensate for and try to avoid throwing too much because it's going to get hit in the form that it's in right now. Basically, to big league hitters, it still looks just very straight without any carry. And that's a problem. So if that doesn't take a step forward, I think there's still a path for him to be a starting pitcher, but now that path is instead of having, number 2 starter type ceiling, it's, well, he's more like Colin Ray probably. Maybe
Yeah.
probably better than Colin Ray because the breaking stuff is better than Colin Ray's breaking stuff. So maybe that's a little bit unfair. But I don't know, maybe Aaron Savali's a better comp then, because Aaron Savali doesn't
Yeah.
have great fastballs. But here's the thing with Aaron Savali, he's got 3 fastballs. He's got the
Right.
4, the 2, and the cutter. DL Hall's just got the 1. And I talked about this in the story, but if that fastball does not come back, and like this is just where it is as a starting pitcher, I don't think that's reason to give up on trying him as a starting pitcher, but it means that now he probably almost certainly is going to have to go down to AAA, like you mentioned, Mitchell, and really find a way to, again, like pitch in a way that minimizes the damage against his four-seamer.
Yeah.
And we did see him do that in some of his bulk outings down the stretch, which I also talked about in the piece. Like he had outings, some of his best outings were outings where he only threw like 35% fastballs and he went really secondary heavy. So I think it can work, especially in smaller samples, like, for a start at a time or a couple starts at a time. But if you're counting on him to make like 30 starts,
Yeah.
I think there needs to be like another fastball variant to keep guys off of that four-seamer even more, because the reality is there's just going to be some days where you can't get by throwing that many off-speed pitches. Like you are going to need to establish a fastball at least a little bit more than a third of the time as a starting pitcher. That's just kind of a reality of pitching. That's kind of one of those things where it's like, well, you can say on the spreadsheet that, hey, this pitch mix should in theory work. But then you get out on the diamond and you very quickly realize like it's not quite the same as it is on paper. Like you need to be able to establish a fastball when you're a starting pitcher and you're trying to work deep into games and all of these things. So again, kind of regardless of how that fastball looks, I want them to try this for another year. And I would say, Mitchell, that if he doesn't earn that spot at a camp, send him down to AAA to keep working on it, because as long as those secondaries are there, to me, the hope that he can be a useful big league starter is there. And I would still rather try that for as long as possible than kick him to the bullpen right away. But the Brewers are going to have a decision to make there, especially if that fastball does not come back as a bulk guy or a stretched out pitcher. They are going to have to make that call of, okay, do we just kick him to the pen then? But I do still want them to try as hard as they can to use those secondaries to mold him into a guy who can navigate a lineup multiple times. And even if now at this point, if he turns into like a number 4 starter, I'd be pretty darn happy with that based on what he's got to work with. But it is a little disappointing now because like we are getting closer to a reality in which everyone's got to kind of just, blink a couple times, take a step back and be like, I mean, this is just who DL Hall is. He's not really the pitcher he was advertised as when they acquired him. Doesn't mean he can't still be a big part of the staff moving forward, but recognizing that also is a key step in how they're going to move forward with him. So I would try him as a starter for as long as you can, but his outlook as a starter is different now than it was a year ago. As far as Ashby goes, I'm with you, Spencer. Like I know you'd mentioned, we'd talked about it in the years before doing this podcast. Like we were both very high on him. Like as one of the very few lefties in baseball who, as a starting pitcher, showed that he could strike a lot of guys out and get a ton of ground balls. Like there's not a lot of pitchers who can do that. A lot of starters, you're either one or the other. You're a big ground ball guy, or you're a big strikeout guy, or you're just kind of mediocre at both. To have both of those as strengths is a rare skill set, and Ashby has that. And he also had a full arsenal of secondaries, just like DL Hall. He has better secondaries than DL Hall does. Like Ashby's secondary pitches have always been his bread and butter. He's had really good breaking stuff. Changeups look good. I think the concern for him is just more so he just can't seem to throw the ball with the right conviction when he's stretched out. And maybe at first that sounds similar to what I talked about with Hall, but I think like Hall has at least shown the ability to throw more effective and better executed breaking pitches while stretched out than even Ashby has. For Ashby, a lot of it is just nothing seems to come together. Like he's had times where he just looks like an absolute mess when he's pitching as a starter, and with where he's at in his development too, like I think you're also probably just getting closer to biting the bullet on him one way or another. Like I do think with DL Hall, I think with where he's at in his development, age-wise, I believe they're about the same age, but just where they're at in their development, I think that you have the flexibility to try to develop DL Hall a little bit more, and where they're at with, like, having options left and different things like that. You have the ability to still try to develop DL Hall as a starter. For Ashby, I think you might be in a spot where you just really need to be like, hey, we know what we have when he's in this role. Let's just go with it. So I, at this point, would just keep him in the pen, and I would use DL Hall as a starter, or at least try to continue developing him on that front. But we'll kind of see what the Brewers decide moving forward. I wouldn't be shocked if they want both guys to remain stretched out, like Chris Hook said, just because they do value that flexibility. And I do wonder from their perspective, like they've seen just how quickly it can come together for Ashby out of the pen. So maybe if they try it one more time, they feel like they can very quickly get him back to that spot where he was in relief down the stretch this year. But we'll see what those guys decide to do. We have one more bit of coaching news to get to, and that is actually the oldest coaching news. It relates to the hitting staff. The Brewers announcing a couple of different changes on that front. Ozzie Timmons is out. The Brewers dismissed him from his position as the lead hitting coach. Al LaBeouf has been promoted from AAA. He was the minor league hitting coach for several years. He will now be the head hitting coach. Connor Dawson is sticking around, and then Eric Tyson is also following Al LaBeouf from the minor leagues. He's going to join the big league staff as well. So the Brewers now have a 3-man hitting coach staff instead of 2. They had kind of co-hitting coaches before with Ozzie Timmons as the lead guy. Now it's going to be Al LaBeouf as the lead guy, with Connor Dawson and Eric Tyson reporting to him as not his kind of his subordinates, but like his assistant hitting coaches, and they're all going to form more of this comprehensive hitting staff. Spencer, I know that as the guy who follows the minor leagues, do you have a little more that you can tell us about Al LaBeouf?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing I know about him is that hitters have just absolutely loved working with him at AAA. I remember, Free Lake especially has called him out as somebody who helped him a lot while he was down there. Tyler Black has talked about him, and I know Terang and all these guys they've all really liked working with him. And this is a guy he's really paid his dues to the coaching world, kind of similar to the Pat Murphy situation in terms of he's been coaching for a long time in the minors. Not only that, but he's gone through a ton of different health things. He's had a few different health scares and stuff. So there's a lot of similarities to Murph. And my guess is that Murph is well aware of those. And he kind of I'm sure he has a bit of a bond with LaBeouf because of that. But either way, I think this is another good way of like what we talked about. It's moving people who worked with a lot of these guys in the minors up, and now they're already with somebody that they're comfortable with. There shouldn't be a huge adjustment period because of that, and the message won't change. And for Timmons, it's unfortunate, obviously, anytime somebody's let go from their position, but I can't speak to what he was doing or anything. I really have no idea how those two were operating, but I do know that Dawson is a big analytical guy. He was always seen as kind of a new school type, and they brought in Timmons to be more of an old school type. My guess is that, and I think they kind of talked about this, but Dawson sounds like he's going to be more of like a game planning type of guy under this new setup with the 3 hitting coaches, is how I was reading it. And then the other 2 are more of the, hands-on. I'm sure Dawson will still be involved hands-on and everything else, but they liked the idea of somebody who could be more involved with just focusing on the game planning part of it. And to be honest, one thing I've noticed over the last few years is that the approach to certain pitchers and stuff, and I always think back to the Max Fried start in the playoffs against the Brewers in 2021. And was that these 2 or was it? I'm just using it as an example, but I can't remember if that was their first year or if that was
that was
Andy Haynes last year.
Nope, that was their first year, because I believe Haynes like go after 2020 or 2021.
That's what I can't remember. Either way, just using
I'm
it
gonna
as
look
an
it up
example,
quick.
I always think back to that game because it was Max Fried just threw curveball after curveball, and it seemed like the Brewers had no idea he was going to do that. And it's just the
Yeah,
easiest game
that
for me
was
to pull
Andy
back.
Haynes' last season, 21. Sorry to cut
Okay.
you off.
Yeah. No, you're good. But either way, like the point is, I think I've noticed that at other times throughout the last few years too, where it's like, okay, this is what a pitcher does well, and we don't seem prepared for what we should know he's going to do. Sometimes pitchers will change their plan of attack, and that can get you and catch you off guard. But like having somebody who's very focused on that, which seems to be part of the plan here, I like that idea. I like the idea of having as many eyes as we can get on them, as long as they're able to convey the same message and there's no, you know, crossing over each other's opinions on guys. I like the idea of just as many thoughts, as many ideas, as many eyes as they can get on hitters, because there's different things work for different hitters, and sometimes more voices can be a bad thing, but a lot of times it just means there's more ideas thrown out and more ways that you can fix things or help guys. So for that reason, I do like this idea, and again, it fits with the move them through the system and keep everybody kind of on the same page as they get to the big leagues. So I like it from that perspective too.
Last thing I want to talk about with this is I think there's a lot of people who are like, well, they just had one of their best offensive seasons in years. Why are they making a change now? And to me, that mirrors the same kind of questions you get of, well, they had a really bad season now. Why is Andy Haynes still here? In that organizations value process a lot. And sometimes they are going to look at the process more or in a different way than they're going to look at the results. So they might look at results under Andy Haynes and say, here's what he had them doing. Here's the personnel he had, the assistants he had, just the group he had to work with. And the bottom line is they might look at all that and say, no, we think he did a pretty good job with that, even if the results were not amazing. Like, we think he was saying the right things to this group. You know, we reviewed his performance. Here's the conclusion we came to. And then on the flip side, you might have a year like this year where you're like, okay, here's the group that we had going into this year. Here was what we noticed in the messaging or the strategy throughout the year. And maybe the Brewers said, even though the results were good, we see a way that they can be better than they were, and a way that we can do it that makes sense for us. Like, we have the ability to institute this change. And maybe if we just kind of switched out some of this messaging, this would be a good idea. I don't know if that's what happened behind the scenes, but that's part of it. Like, organizations value process a lot,
Yep.
because if you get too caught up in results, you can make some not so smart decisions. And there's a fine line there, because like there are points where you do need to look at the results to evaluate your process, but it's all kind of this big sea of factors that you have to weigh. So you're going to have times where, you know, guys might think, hey, they should fire this guy. The Brewers are looking at some other things more closely that say, no, this guy's doing the right thing. We'll hang on to him. Then on the flip side, there might be times where it's like, well, the results look pretty good this year. And the Brewers are looking at some deeper things and say, yeah, but it could have been better. Here's something that we can do and we're going to do. And we just think this is going to put us in an even better spot moving forward. So that's just something to keep in mind when you see moves like this and you're kind of wondering, well, that seems odd. Why did they make a change here? Or why didn't they make a change here? All kinds of things that go on behind the scenes. But that pretty much does it for all of the coaching stuff that we wanted to get through. There has been one small piece of offseason player related news in the initial hours after the World Series. This one won't take very long to talk about. Wade Miley is not going to have his $12 million mutual option picked up. The Brewers declined that. So that makes him a free agent at this moment. It's a $1.5 million buyout. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because number one, mutual options are basically never picked up anyway. More often than not, they're kind of a way to modify how the money in a deal is allocated, because you have
Yeah.
buyouts on the back end of that. So from that standpoint alone, even if Miley had pitched a full productive season, that probably was not getting picked up. But now, especially because he hardly pitched at all this year, undergoing Tommy John surgery, pretty much a given that wasn't going to be picked up. That doesn't mean he can't come back. It just means that he's not going to be back on a 1-year, $12 million deal like that option would have called for. Spencer, I think that's pretty straightforward. Do you have any comments on that, or can we keep the program rolling along?
No. I will say maybe this is actually coaching news. Who knows? Maybe he'll be back as a coach next year. That can't be ruled out. But
He has expressed
no,
interest in that, but
there's really
we'll
nothing else
see.
to talk about.
No, but last we heard, we haven't heard anything about whether he's made a decision on whether he wants to pitch next year or not. He was kind of on the fence a little bit, so we'll see how his rehab is going. But we know at the very least it will not be on that contract that he would have had under that mutual option for next year. With that, we can start to move on to some additional listener questions that we got this week. Where should we start? Going through the list here. I think we can start with Red Venture, who asked us about William Contreras and his older brother, Wilson Contreras. So he's looking at Wilson Contreras' production in his early 30s at the same position William's playing. They're both catchers. And he asks, does what Wilson Contreras is doing with the Cardinals, which is remaining a pretty productive hitter, does that give you more confidence about an extension for William? And then he kind of threw out some numbers of, what would it take to get it done? Would 10-year, $155 million work? Would he shoot more for Buster Posey's $167 million contract or Joe Mauer's $180 million contract? What is he going to be shooting for? And then he kind of threw some benchmark numbers in there as well. Just looking at what he's done over the last 3 seasons, he's more or less kind of on the same pace that his brother was on in terms of just wrapping up the overall production. So he's got a 130 WRC plus over his last 3 seasons. His brother is at 133. And even if he kind of stays close to that range, that's still decent production for like a first base DH type, if that's where he has to move down the stretch. So, Spencer, I can kind of start with you on this one. How are you feeling about, well, first of all, I guess these are kind of 2 different things. Would William be interested, and then would you be willing to do it? You want to touch on at least the latter one first? Let's just assume for the sake of the hypothetical that he is interested in sticking around. What do you think it's going to take, and do you think that's a worthwhile investment for the Brewers, or are there some other factors that we kind of need to wait a little bit to figure out first?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I'm sure it's something the Brewers are actually, at least running through kind of their process this offseason to see if it's something they want to explore. I personally would have a very hard time extending a catcher that long and that far into his career and that type of age. And you make a very fair point that if he continues this type of production, then he would be fine as a first base DH type, and you'd probably still be getting okay value out of that. But I also have a hard time seeing him aging that well offensively, where it feels like he's actually that productive as a first base or DH. I probably would not go anywhere near 10 years for William, but I would explore something that I'm sure he would have a hard time being on board with it, but more into, buying out 3 or 4 years of his free agency. I could see something like that making sense from the Brewers' perspective. But in his case, he'd probably be looking for more along the lines of, 8, 9, 10 years to try and buy out into his beyond the prime of his career. And the Brewers would be trying to buy the prime of his career. So I doubt anything ends up happening with this. I'm personally, in a lot of ways, similar to relievers. I'm kind of anti-paying catchers unless they're very young. But he's the type of guy who's at least young enough where it makes some sense to consider it in the right deal where I could see it happening. I have a hard time seeing them line up, I guess, on numbers where it would make sense for both sides.
Yeah, and I think as long as we're on the topic of comparing the 2 brothers, these are going to be slightly different situations. So Wilson's on, what is it, a 5-year deal, but he signed it at like age 30, so it'll take him through his mid-30s. William, if you're signing it right now, he's, 27, 26, 27, entering his age 27 season. So a 10-year deal takes him through a little bit longer than where Wilson's at, but that kind of explains like the disconnect and why we're thinking 10 now compared to the 5 that Wilson signed for. Wilson is also only 2 years through that contract. We don't know how the next 3 are going to go, and I'm actually curious to see what route this follows because Yasmani Grandal, I remember being not happy when the Brewers did not re-sign him because I'm looking at this guy, and this was probably in my early years of publicly publishing my analysis when it probably wasn't as good as it is now. Or I don't want to even give myself that much of a pat on the back. Let's just say I've gotten better at it since those first 2 years. Not that I'm perfect, but I remember looking at him and being like, okay, this is a guy who, on top of already arguably being one of the best offensive catchers in baseball, he's also an excellent pitch framer. He had the statistical case as the best catcher in baseball that season he was with the Brewers. And I looked at the skill set. I'm like, okay, framing, the guys who are really good at it, they don't seem to forget how to do it. Like that skill seems to last pretty long. And then I also looked at the fact of he gets on base a lot. He walks. He's got a really good eye at the plate. So I was kind of thinking that should probably age pretty well too, as opposed to a guy who's a little bit more of a free swinger. Yasmani Grandal signed for, it was 4 or 5 years with the White Sox. I think it was 4. And the first 2 years were pretty good. He remained pretty good over those first 2 years, dealt with some injuries, but when he was on the field, he was still really good. And then it pretty much just collapsed in the final 2 years of that deal. Like the aging curve for catchers, we've seen some examples where it doesn't even happen gradually. Like guys just almost fall apart. Grandal's an example of it. We saw it happen to Jonathan Lucroy pretty quickly after he left Milwaukee. And he's also an interesting one to look at as well because Lucroy was another guy kind of similar to William where he started young and he caught a lot before age 30. And I think that caught up to him ultimately like right after he turned 30. Like I think that's part of the reason why the decline was just so sudden. But I'm with you. I don't like paying catchers for that reason because it can happen so quickly.
Yeah.
I will also add as well, I don't even view William as good of a defender as Grandal was at the time Grandal left. So like even by that alone, like I'm probably not even putting him on quite the same level as I would have put Grandal on at the time he left Milwaukee. And if that contract even didn't go very well, it's tough to swallow giving him that much money. And I don't think I would pursue something in that 10-year range. To me, it was always going to be more about if they were going to extend him, it was maybe going to be a situation of you buy out his remaining ARB years and maybe you tack on like a year or two. But I think the time to do that was last season, not right now. I think that possibility is out the window. And I think looking back, it never really seemed like, looking from the outside at least, like he had a whole lot of interest in signing a deal like that. I think he was confident in just going year to year in arbitration, which is probably going to end up being a very favorable path for him to go if that's how he wanted to play it. But I'm mostly with you on this. There's also the discussion about what it takes to get it done. My guess is he's not going to shoot for the Mauer money because Mauer is going to go down as, he doesn't have the longevity of one of the best catchers of all time, but his peak is, you can make a case that his peak is one of the best peaks ever for a catcher. So William hasn't hit that high. He probably won't hit that high unless he really figures out how to elevate the baseball way more consistently. You know, if he has like a 40 home run season, like I think he's capable of based on how hard he hits the ball, it's a different discussion. But I don't think right now he's shooting that high. I would guess, though, he's probably looking for close to 10 years in an extension because, like you said, Spencer, he would want something that probably takes him to the back half of his 30s because if he's going to take that money now in lieu of pursuing free agency in a couple of years, he is going to want some serious security because he's basically giving up what will be his other only chance to get paid. So I think the 10-year estimate isn't very far off. I'd probably put him closer to, I'm going to say like the Posey range. I think that's a decent guess for what he would be asking for.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's something I would fully feel comfortable signing because, again, like you don't know. It could happen very abruptly that all of a sudden the offense just falls off a cliff, and then you have that at that first base DH position. That's the thing with signing someone, especially with the expectation that they're going to play those positions. Like, you can take Joe Mauer as an example. He was still a perfectly fine hitter even during the back half of that deal. But when you're hitting for like a 105 OPS plus as a first baseman, you're not a very valuable player just because of the position that you're at. And if William fell to that as a first base DH type, all of a sudden he's not a whole lot better than a replacement level player unless he becomes an amazing defensive first baseman. Mauer did have that going for him. He turned into a very good first baseman and was able to develop himself over there on the field. William does not, to me, have the build of a guy who would be a good defensive first baseman. So I think that's something you need to weigh as well. To me, there's too many red flags here to be fully comfortable with this, and I don't think there's ever a market value extension you sign a guy to that you're 100% comfortable with. But to me, there's enough things going on here to give me some misgivings about that. So I would say the comparison to Wilson, jury's still out on that one because we don't know what happened to Wilson once he got to like age 34, 35, because he's not quite there yet. We'll see how that goes. But by the time we get there, we're already past the point of having this discussion about William anyway. So I get what we're trying to go for here, but I guess the long-winded answer that I'm getting to here is it doesn't really do a lot for me. I don't think that's something I'd be super interested in pursuing if I were the Brewers. Could move on to a couple more questions. Nick asks us about a prediction he saw saying that Devin Williams could go to the Red Sox in a trade this year. So this can be another good question for Spencer, the prospect guy. Who besides Richard Fitz should the Brewers want in return from Boston if that's who they enter negotiations with?
It's a good question. The Red Sox have a very solid system now in terms of like matching up with what I'm anticipating the Brewers wanting, which is near major league ready or major league ready, at least one of the players to be major league ready. Richard Fitz is a good fit. And also I just understood why he said good name on that now that I'm reading it again. But Chase Mydroth is another interesting name. He plays some third base. He is extremely I would consider him passive at the plate, but he had a 437 on base percentage this year because he draws a ton of walks. Outside of that, his profile's somewhat Tyler Black-ish in terms of he doesn't hit the ball super hard, but he does hit it at pretty ideal launch angles. And he's a solid defender at third base. He doesn't have a cannon or anything, but I could see that being the type of guy they'd be interested in just because we've talked about it before. They're probably going to need a third baseman heading into next season. And then another name I saw, Hunter Dobbins, is a right-handed pitcher who he already made his major league debut out of the pen, but he is seen as a starter moving forward. He's got bunch of different pitches. He's got a cutter and a fastball, which the Brewers tend to like that type of combination. He probably wouldn't be considered the headliner, I would guess. He's kind of a little bit lower on most prospect lists, but I think the Brewers would probably like him quite a bit more than wherever these lists have him. So those are the three names that stand out mostly because I think they're kind of the type of age range and timeline wise where the Brewers would be looking for somebody in return for Devin.
AZ Brewers fan asks us, who would you trade, Sal Frelick or Garrett Mitchell? They say they can't see the Brewers keeping both of them with Yelich coming back and then Churio as well coming back, obviously long-term. Going to need everyday playing time for both of those guys. And then they also asked, could that help the Brewers get a shortstop or third baseman for one of them? Or could they use Devin Williams to get a shortstop or third baseman? Or is someone like Ha-Seong Kim available in free agency? after he presumably is not going to be picked up for the rest of that contract that he has. So I would probably still say Mitchell, just because you can get some guys to bite at the ceiling, I think. You can get some teams to bite at the ceiling. I don't think you'd get a lot for Sal at this point. To me, you're still selling high on Mitchell right now as opposed to selling lower on Frelick, and that's really what it comes down to. Again, we've talked a lot about the concerns we have about Garrett Mitchell, and as good as the production's been, I don't think he's done enough in those specific areas that we're concerned about to alleviate those concerns. Oddly enough, he just has not really faced opponents who have tried to exploit the holes in his game very often, which is still weird to me. So he hasn't really had the opportunity to prove us wrong on those fronts specifically, like the hole in the swing at the top of the zone. But I think you could still get teams interested in the ceiling, especially if he's healthy now. Sal Frelick, on the other hand, you're talking about a guy who's kind of just been a solid 2-win player, but a lot of that's coming from the glove. The bat hasn't shown you much. In fact, the bat's actually been quite discouraging with just the total inability to hit the ball hard. Although I shouldn't even say total inability, because we've seen him swing harder and hit the ball harder, like that home run in the wild card series, and it is an example. And that's something else I covered a few weeks ago at Brewer Fanatic, talking about how moving forward, he should probably be okay with trading a little bit of how compact his swing is, like making it a little bit longer so he can generate at least a little more bat speed and a little more whip through the zone to make a little more loud contact. That doesn't mean he needs to change his profile and really get away from what he's good at, which is making contact. But right now, he's just too short. He's too short to the point that he doesn't hit the ball hard whatsoever, and that's just not going to work. But again, if you're looking at who's got the higher value right now, it's tough to know. It can depend on the guy. But I would still pick Garrett Mitchell. That said, the Brewers still don't need to trade anybody. Like, the same things we keep talking about with flexibility and the ability to keep all of these guys, those things are all still true. Like, that situation hasn't actually changed a whole lot. You're still going to have DH time for Christian Yelich. These guys still have options left. Like, if you really needed to, you could send somebody down. Like, there's still nothing that's forcing you to get one out the door here. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. That said, I do think there's a little bit of a higher likelihood someone gets moved this offseason than in past off seasons. And part of that could be influenced by what you're talking about. Like, if there is a deal for them with someone else to swing an infielder from somebody, I think that would be worth pursuing. But again, when you're talking about trading guys, there needs to be a fit in terms of what the other side can offer. But there's also an element of, we just need to get the best package for this guy. Positions be damned. So you can't always go into negotiations saying, well, we need this position, so we're going to try to use Garrett Mitchell to get this position. You can't always go into it with that approach, because that's how you end up accepting a deal that's maybe not the greatest deal that you could take. You're not getting the most value back that you could for him. So that's something to keep in mind as well. It's also true with Devin Williams. But I do think this needs to be a route that they need to explore, and if things come together in that way, they should go for it, I think. As far as Kim goes from San Diego, assuming that he becomes a free agent, I think he's definitely an option for them. Not sure that that's who they'd end up with, though, but he's definitely someone who would be an option for him. Spencer, do you have any thoughts similar or different on any of that?
No, I agree with everything you said. I think it's Mitchell, because you would be selling high versus selling low on Frelick if you're choosing between the two. But my main point was going to be they don't need to. I know it feels like a logjam, and it feels like there's never going to be a way to get all these guys the playing time that they need or deserve or whatever. But like, we still haven't seen Garrett Mitchell play anywhere close to a full season healthy. We still haven't seen Yelich play a full season in terms of health for quite a while. And once you have those two, I mean, now you're down to 3 outfielders in, Frelick, Perkins, and Churio. That's how quickly it goes. Like, it would not be surprising, I don't think, to anybody to see both Mitchell and Yelich get hurt early in the season, and suddenly we're bringing up Tyler Black to play outfield or something. Like there's depth, but that's a good thing. It's good to have depth, and it's good to have guys that you trust. Now, again, that doesn't mean you don't make a trade if the right one comes around. We've talked a lot about, and we actually got a question that mentions it later, but like the Trent Grisham trade for Luis Urias was a trade that made a lot of sense for both teams because both teams needed a player at the position that they were trading for. They were both young players with some ceiling left. That type of deal might come around and it might make sense for everybody involved, but you don't have to go searching it out, I think is kind of the point we both agree on, is that it's let it come to you. Definitely have conversations on them like they always do and see what happens. But I don't think there's any need to force one of them out the door.
Take a couple questions from Patrick, who touched on a couple of different fronts here. I know he also talked about, Frelick and Mitchell and all this stuff. I think this is actually going to go with kind of bouncing off of what we just talked about. So he said Frelick's got a high floor as a hitter, not a very high ceiling. So there he's talking about, the not hitting the ball hard, like the good plate discipline and contact mean that even closer to his worst form, we're going to see more of kind of what we've already seen, which is he's a playable MLBer. But then he's also probably not going to become a star either because he doesn't hit for much power. And then Mitchell has the lower floor, but the high ceiling on the other end. And his question is just, how would teams value these kind of guys? Is there a guy who, if he has a high floor, does that make him more valuable? Or are teams going to be more excited about trying to bet on a high ceiling guy to figure it out? And he kind of touched on this as well, just knowing everyone's got different models and different formulas. And he brought up the Urias and Grisham trade. I think that's really all you can say about it. Really, it's going to vary from organization to organization. And this is actually a question I asked Pat Murphy at one point this year. Like, how do you guys approach like the player development side? Like, what's the difference between a high floor, low ceiling guy, or a low floor, high ceiling guy? Or I think another way I phrased it too is like, how do different skill sets impact all of that? And I was talking about Mitchell versus Sal because they have very different skill sets. And basically his response was, I know what you're trying to get at here, but it's so hard to give a concrete answer to because it varies so much from player to player, from team to team. Like, it's just nobody has a concrete answer on any of this. So I guess that means that we can't really give a concrete answer either. But it really is just, you need to check in with teams and you negotiate with teams, and that's how you figure out how they value guys. That's kind of all you can do. So, these kinds of discussions, I'm sure they're ongoing all the time between the Brewers and other franchises and other organizations. That's really all there is to say about it. So, Spencer, I saw you nodding along. I don't know if you really have anything to add to that other than it's just kind of a trial by error a little bit to see how guys value different teams. I mean, you had the A's who, whatever it was about Echeverry Ruiz's profile, they loved him. And maybe that was that they thought he had a high floor because he's playing center field and he's really speedy. Maybe that is what they thought. Who knows? Because he doesn't really have the power to be a high ceiling guy. So maybe the A's are a team that said, hey, high floor, that's what we like. But it's tough to know depending on, who you're talking about. So another question Patrick had for us was, if you guys were to try to give a sales pitch to a free agent on why they should come to Milwaukee, what would be your main points other than regular season success? I would say, depending on the position, I think playing time could be one of them. You could tell a guy like, hey, you're going to hit in the middle of our order here, as opposed to if you sign somewhere else where you're hitting at the bottom of the order. Maybe that means more at bats for you, better chance to, if you don't want to stick around here long term, you can better your standing for the next time that you dip into free agency. If you have a guy who's signing a 1 or 2 year type deal, especially like a bounce back type deal, I think that could be a point you can make to guys. I think the culture is another big one as well. Especially with the group the Brewers had this last year, you could bring in a lot of guys from that clubhouse who are going to be coming back next year and you can bring him in and they can tell this guy, like, this was one of the most tight-knit groups that I've ever played with. And
Mhm.
you had guys saying that in this clubhouse throughout the entire year, and I think that counts for something. I think also just assuming Reese Hoskins opts into next year as well, he's probably a good guy who you could have speak to that as well. A guy who came from a bigger market in Philly to the smallest market in Milwaukee and has taken pretty well to the city and to the team and to the fan base and all these things, even if the on-field production hasn't been quite what he wanted it to be. I think he's a good example of someone who can just kind of vouch for being in a similar position not long ago in free agency, signing with the Brewers, who maybe would normally not be perceived as a favorite for more of a household name, but they ended up being a good interpersonal fit. I think those are probably two of the main points you would touch on if you're not gonna, or if you've already hit on regular season success and you want to have some supplemental points as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say along those lines, like a family environment is kind of something almost every player talks about when they leave Milwaukee, when they're in Milwaukee. Like it often comes up. I think depending on the position, especially for pitchers and stuff, you'd be selling the fact that we tend to get the most out of you and maximize your abilities. And for some guys, that carries on into different contracts and more money down the line. Like I'm sure Jordan Lyles would speak highly of what the Brewers did for him because he got quite a bit more money after that than he would have before coming to the Brewers. So I think that type of thing can come up too. But otherwise, yeah, those are the two main points I think I would have brought up as well.
Yeah, I was thinking more from like a hitter standpoint, but the pitching stuff is a good point as well. Like there have been guys who have specifically said on record, like, I signed here because of the reputation that these guys have with developing
Yep.
pitchers, or because we had a meeting and we were on the same page about like, hey, here are more of the technical analytical kind of things that we've been looking at. Here's what we want to develop. Here's what we think you can do. You know, like Rob Zistrizny, who we talked about before, was an example of that. Like had a meeting with the Brewers in free agency, just as a minor league free agent. And, you know, they kind of just synced right away on the things that they were observing, the adjustments that they wanted to make. And it ended up being what both sides thought would be a good partnership. He only pitched in a few games for the Brewers this year, but did get back to the big leagues. And if the Brewers want to, they can keep him moving forward. So we'll see what happens with him. But that's an example as well. So there are a couple different things that you can point to on those fronts. Final question we'll take for this week. And as a reminder, if we didn't get to your question this week, there's a good chance that we might roll it over into the next episode. That's something that we've talked about doing a little bit more with the off-season version of the pod. But the last question we'll take on more of a lighthearted note. And I said we'd take this one because we arrived on the same answer almost immediately. Matt Trueblood, our wonderful editor-in-chief, asked us, if you were automatically out unless you completed one cartwheel somewhere between home plate and first base, which Brewers player would gain the most value? And as an aside, he asks, could Reese Hoskins ever record a hit again? No. To that second question, that is, the player who would gain the most value from his ability to do a cartwheel while running from home to first as a prerequisite for getting a hit, I would say Blake Perkins, hands down. Perkins just seems like the guy who would be very good at very niche athletic feats, like doing a cartwheel down the
Yep,
first baseline. So I think he would have the most to gain. I know you said something similar. You had the same answer, like right away.
I did. Yep. Yep. Perk was my first thought as well. I had Mitchell cross the mind, but I figured he'd probably get injured in the process of trying to cartwheel. So we decided to move on from that thought and move to Perkins. On the Hoskins note, I feel like we have to clarify how stringent we're being on like the definition of a cartwheel, because I feel like he could do like some, I mean, he might get hurt too, but I think he could do a half cartwheel type thing. If his feet got to go straight up and over the top, like, no, he's not doing it. But if we can do like, you know, feet maybe get above the shoulders, you know, then maybe we're calling it a cartwheel. Like I think he could get some in the gap. He hits a ball in the gap, he might get a single on it. But yeah, I think it's Perkins. You know, any of the outfielders, honestly, I could see being good at it. I could see Sal being good at it. Sal would probably do it in some like crazy dust up way where he would end up like just covered in dirt. but he would end up doing a decent cartwheel at the end of it. Like, those would be all the guys that would cross my mind, are pretty much all the outfielders. Yelich, I don't want you doing cartwheels. Let's just keep that back healthy, buddy. You just make your way to first, and we'll pretend you did one, and we'll allow you to do that. But all the other young outfielders, those are probably the ones you got to pick from.
So my follow-up question now, after thinking about this some more, is I'm assuming this also applies for home runs. Like if you hit the ball out of play as a home run, you still need to do the cartwheel. But because that ball's not in play anymore, do you get unlimited chances and time to try to execute that cartwheel, or are they going to have like a cartwheel timer, like the pitch timer, where you have X amount of seconds after the ball clears the fence to complete the cartwheel, so that we're not sitting here watching you try to do a cartwheel for 25 minutes just so that the run can count? Like I don't know why I'm taking this so seriously, but there need to be some follow-up rules for additional edification here if we're really going to go deep into this. You know us, we have to get technical about everything. So I think that's a good note to end on, though, for the question portion. With that, we can pivot to Spencer Michaelis's favorite section of the pod, that being the minor league sandbox. Take it away.
Oh, yeah. All right. Well, we've got some AFL updates. We've got a couple winter ball updates. Otherwise, still not a ton to talk about here. Hopefully, at some point, the Brewers make a random trade for a minor leaguer, and then I can dig into them. But for now, we'll stick with the AFL. Juan Baez, we've talked about him last time, how well he was doing to start off the season. That's continued. Coming into today, I haven't had a chance. They did play today. I know he had at least one hit, but coming into today, he had 53 plate appearances, and he had an 1100 OPS with 2 homers, which is really good to see because he hadn't really shown. He had only hit 1 homer in the regular season. But from the sound of it, the eggs of velos aren't really showing that he's going to be, at least for now, a guy that hits for much pop. Both the homers were hit under 100 miles per hour, which, you hit them down the line, you can do that, but it's not really a sign of somebody actually having a lot of power. Luis Lara had a 690 OPS coming into today, but he was still getting pretty good reviews from the people who are actually there. I don't think the stats not being great are going to hurt him much, at least in the public eye in terms of prospecting, barring, some terrible finish where he just struggles terribly for the last couple of weeks. I think he'll come out of it with people probably a bit higher on him than when he came in. On the opposite side of that, Brock Wilken has continued to struggle mightily. He is at a 507 OPS, and the batted ball data is not really going against that at all. He has a 31% strikeout rate. He has hit a couple homers, but that's pretty much all we've seen. It's just, unfortunately, again, a continuation of a really rough second half to his minor league season. Hopefully we can get into the offseason, get him a little further removed from that hit by pitch to the face, and maybe we'll see some better results. I know he also did just have a kid during the season, so a lot of stuff going on. You never know what's weighing on a guy mentally, but it's been a rough one for Brock Wilken. So hopefully we'll see a better 2025. On the pitching side, Ryan Burchard, still, he's had too many walks. In fact, I think he's at 12 walks to 11 strikeouts. But the stuff has been really, really good. Like if you just look at the pure stuff, there's a major league pitcher in there somewhere, but the walks are going to have to get a lot better than they have been. I will say he was on StatCast for a couple of these outings, and if the StatCast was showing everything correctly, he was getting squeezed like crazy in 2 of his starts where he had pitches completely in the zone being called balls. So that may be playing a role here. AFL umps might not be great, but it has not been a great stat line for him. Coleman Crow has been kind of the opposite. He showed really good control. He's only walked 2 guys, but he's allowed a ton of base hits and a couple of homers. But really, honestly, coming off of Tommy John, his stuff is getting back to where it was. He's showing an ability to be in the zone, which is often a problem for people coming off arm injuries. I think the Brewers are probably seeing a lot of things that they like in his outings. He's a guy who might need to be, or he would need to be, protected from the Rule 5 draft this year if the Brewers think he's going to get picked, so he might be added to the 40-man. On the reliever side, they pretty much all struggled. Will Childers has been okay. In fact, he's done okay. Like I haven't looked at his FIP. I don't even know if it's available for the AFL, but strikeouts, walks, all that stuff is fine, but he's kind of been killed by 2 homers with a couple guys on base both times. So in a small sample, that can really balloon the ERA. But those are the AFL guys. Again, relievers I might talk about more at the end of the season, but more specifically at least. But it's all really small sample stuff right now. On the winter ball side, Hedbert Perez is playing in the Dominican Republic, and through 19 plate appearances, again, small samples on all of these, but he's batting .412 with 474 on base and a .529 slug. That's a 1003 OPS. He has 7 hits. One of those is a triple. He's walked twice, and he's only struck out 4 times. So those are both good things to see in a small sample against pretty good competition. They're playing a lot of former major leaguers, upper level minors players. A lot of those guys are over there pitching and playing in that league. So it's good to see him have decent success early on. Eduardo Garcia is a shortstop for the Brewers in the Brewers system. He's been in it for a while. He has always been a really, really good glove with a pretty bad offensive profile. He can hit the ball hard and far, but he strikes out a ton and he hits the ball on the ground a lot. He's hitting .308 in, this is 14 plate appearances. He has 4 hits, but he has 3 doubles in that span. So he's got a .538 slug. He has not walked, and that is a continuation of his entire career where he's never drawn walks at any rate. And that's always hurt him because, like I said, there are some interesting components to his offensive profile, but if you don't draw walks, you strike out a lot, and you don't hit for much average, you really got to hit for power and at least start drawing some walks on that side too. So the other news on the winter ball side isn't really even minor league stuff, but we did learn that Oliver Dunn will be playing over there soon. So that'll be his first game action since he originally got hurt. So we'll see, probably update on him later on in a different episode, but good to see that he's going to be back playing in games. Clearly that means he's getting close and he should be ready for spring training, barring some sort of setback. So a potential third base candidate. It'll be interesting to follow him, but that's all I got on the minor league side. I'll dig up as much as I can during this time, but it's limited. I don't have 4 affiliates playing at all times and maybe even a complex league like I do during the season. So we'll find what we can, but on the hitting side, it's mostly good news from the prospects, I would say.
I think everyone still appreciates the effort regardless. So thank you for being a sicko for minor league baseball. Very informative to everybody else. That'll do it for us this week. Thank you all for listening. Like I said before, you can expect podcasts every other week throughout the off season, unless there's some kind of major news that breaks, be it a major departure from anyone, major acquisition, whether it's coaching, player side, whatever that may be. Other than that, though, we'll stick to that release schedule. So thank you all for listening. Hopefully this was at least somewhat informative for you. We'll have some more content for you as we progress throughout the off season. But until then, I don't know. I can't really say, like I said last week, I can't say go Brewers because there's no baseball going on. So I don't know. Take it easy. That doesn't sound right though.
Go front office. Do a good job this offseason.
I don't like that. That sounds tacky. That's
I thought it rolled up.
I know you're not.
Very well.
You're not a Seinfeld guy, are you? Because the take it easy reminds me of there's an episode where George says take it easy to someone as they're getting out of the car, and then he's just sitting in the car repeating it to himself because he thought it was the stupidest thing to say. But you're not going to get that reference anyway because you're not cultured. Hopefully somebody got that reference.
I've watched some of it. I don't think I've seen that episode.
Well, we're going to have to do something about that. I'm sure somebody got the reference and knows what I'm talking about. It's the one where he declined to go up into the apartment for coffee. So someone's got to get that, and hopefully that's a good note for everybody to leave on and take with them until next time. So thank you all for listening.